Welcome to the new study group, everyone. This is the first week we've done yet, and we're just looking at the very basics of socialist and Marxist theory. I'll just do a quick overview of the videos and texts that we were looking at this week. In the first video, which is titled Marxism 101, Wolff introduces basic concepts including the very fundamentals of exploitation and how political power stems from economic power. And in the second video, he goes into detail about these and cites historical examples from the development of capitalism in America. The excerpts from Jacobin's ABCs of Socialism aims to answer some frequently asked questions about socialism, specifically what we mean by socialism as opposed to a welfare state or a social democracy, and why it is that we as socialists talk a lot about workers and the working class. In Principles of Communism, Engels introduces and explains some important terminology, and in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, he goes into detail about really the history of the development of socialist and communist ideas and how the first philosophers were effectively idealists or utopians, and how essentially Marxist ideas developed against that background. The way we will structure this is I will basically just read out the questions, I'll give people a chance to answer them, and then I'll come in with my answers and we can kind of compare those. I'm not going to be basically telling anyone whether their answer is right or wrong. I think we can collectively make those judgments or help anyone who wants it. So the first question is, briefly explain the difference between Marx's materialism and Hegel's idealism. Does anyone want to take that up?
Hegel believed that that change was founded on ideas, and Marx believed that it was founded on materials or material conditions, I think.
More specifically, that it's the dialectical movement of ideas in sort of opposition as opposed to the movement of productive forces in opposition as in Marx's materialism.
Idealists believe that ideals are responsible for structuring society. Materialists observe that material reality frequently fails to correspond with ideals, and that material conditions, including the way we produce what we need to survive, dictate social realities. I'll just read out what Captain ACAB has said here in the text channel. I would take that a step further and say that material reality produces ideas. Foucault formulates this as knowledge doesn't create power, power creates knowledge. And I say I would agree with that. Material reality is responsible for generating ideas.
There's a philosophy professor who's in my organization, and when we studied Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, he presented the idea that Hegel, in fact, was a materialist in his formulation of what an idea was, in a similar way to how the idea that material reality produces ideas, he viewed the idea as being more of a sociological structure existing outside of humanity than necessarily what we see as an idea as something existing within the minds of society.
I would go as far as to say that the idea of knowledge creating power must therefore imply a meritocracy, and that would rely on kind of infinite resources to be around, and that's simply not true.
I don't think that's necessarily implied. I mean, you can assume that the people with a greater starting point, greater beginning capital, would educate their, their descendants much better. Even if you take the argument that knowledge creates power, there's still a way to explain why current power structures would continue. I mean, I don't think it's correct. I'm just saying there's an argument there.
I think the question that it doesn't really come into it is what creates knowledge, and well, it's materials.
So I believe we're generally in agreement then that an idealist point of view essentially justifies existing power structures, as Captain ACAB has pointed out?
Yes.
NG has commented in text that we can't just wish the problems of society away or convince ourselves that there are problems to solve. It's not a matter of Hegelian movement towards a highest idea or Feuerbach's notion of just setting the ideas right. We have to practically act against it.
I also think idealism puts too much stress on the individual as an agent of change. There's very much this idea that, essentially great person theory, that a great thinker comes up with an idea, the idea is regarded as correct, and then social movement continues. Whereas I would go so far to argue that just because of the inherent contradictions within capitalist production and accumulation, that we could get rid of all knowledge of Marx, all knowledge of Lenin, every scrap of the communist movement, and the ideas would come again in a short amount of time just due to the observation of those contradictions.
Yeah, you see, this is what I often say, is that it's not that Marx invented socialism, it's that Marx discovered it and codified it, and it would have turned up either way.
Yeah, well, Marx's own analysis basically makes the conclusion inevitable that Marx himself was a product of the conditions created by capitalist society.
There's a great Rosa Luxemburg quote for that. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's essentially saying that just as capital was a necessary part of human progression, so is the social proletariat a necessary part of capital, in the sense that capitalism creates its own gravedigger.
Well, it's part of the. It's what people mean when they talk about dialectical relationships. The very concept of private property designates the fact that some people have it and some people don't. And when you extend that to means of production, it means you are going to have a bourgeois class, a capitalist class who owns the means of production, and those who don't, and those who are forced underneath that regime to react against it in some way.
I'll just read out what Captain ACAB has typed here. There's a very vested interest in pushing this marketplace of ideas bullshit that liberals love, because those in power know that ideas alone, without practice or practical action, are powerless to produce change. This is why we need praxis, theory combined with practical action in order to create change. Ideas without action are toothless, action without ideas are directionless. It's very quotable.
Another comment on saying that it is knowledge that creates power. Actually, you need the material conditions for that knowledge to turn up. Power, in a sense, creates knowledge, and a good quote on that, I think, is I'm paraphrasing, but I'm less concerned by the minds of Einstein and Newton and things, but that minds akin to those have lived and died in sweatshops and unaccommodating conditions.
Okay, I think we'll try to move the discussion on. I'll just read out the next question here. And this topic was also introduced in the Marxism 101 video. What is capitalist exploitation? Why do capitalists hire workers?
Is it too jargony to just say the extraction of surplus value?
Profiting off of someone else's labour is called theft.
And I feel like we should probably explain the conception of what surplus value is. But capitalist exploitation is essentially just the extraction of surplus value.
Yeah, and we will go into more detail about that. We're going to be doing a week on political economy. We will actually be approaching the terminology, the proper ways to explain things. This week it's going to be necessarily a little bit, I don't want to say simplistic, but simplified in how we're explaining things. I'll just read out my answer and you can kind of critique it. Capitalists hire workers so that they can add value to raw materials. The capitalist then sells the products of the worker's labour, commodities, and receives more for them than he spent on the raw materials. He makes a profit. Out of this arrangement, the worker receives a fixed wage. The capitalist has extracted value from the worker's ability to labour, which is to say he has exploited the worker.
It makes it sound as if the worker can be paid a wage equal to the value of his labour.
Directly on that point that Maoist Dago just brought up, it's something that tends to confuse a lot of people. When I say that, I mean mostly liberals, that when we talk about the exploitation of labor, that it tends to conjure up in a lot of people's heads the idea that, well, okay, the problem with capitalism is that people are not being paid what they're worth or what the true value of their labor is. And if we can fix that and get people paid exactly what value they put in to any given commodity or production process, then we'll have a quote unquote just system of political economy. The problem with that characterization is that Marx's entire point in setting up his analysis of capitalism is that that can't happen. And there are practical reasons why that can't happen on a day-to-day level. It's actually very difficult to pinpoint exactly how much value each individual person puts into any given commodity, and then cross that with the inputs that need to go into any given production process. What we call profit is a derivative of surplus value. Surplus value is produced in a production process, but that surplus value is chipped away at in terms of paying for new inputs or new means of production or credit or taxes or any number of other inputs that go into it. More importantly, though, on a slightly more conceptual level, the reason that can't happen, that people cannot be paid exactly what they're worth, is that it would grind capitalism to a halt. Businesses could not actually expand unless people were to self-exploit themselves to create a kind of voluntary surplus value to expand a given firm. In a way, it actually boils down to a lot of the problems with so-called market socialism, but that's another topic.
And this, kind of to differ from the point a bit, this extraction only takes place because of property. And if you had workers making decisions about it, they would never have unequal distribution. It just doesn't make any sense because that doesn't benefit somebody. And therefore, it must be enforced.
I get what you're saying in terms of property and that, but we need to stress that workers can self-exploit. For example, in a co-op situation, workers are capable of extracting their own surplus value democratically. It doesn't make it not exploitation. It's just framed differently.
Is the worker themselves saying, I'll exploit my own labor?
One thing I want to stress real quick, and it kind of goes back to another thing in terms of how this terminology brings certain notions into how we talk about them. When Marx talks about exploitation, he talks about it in a very quantitative way. It's the ratio of value produced by a given worker versus what they actually receive. And while the term itself does have moralistic implications, we talk about the exploitation of people all the time in various different ways, and we tend to talk about it as a morally bad thing. In this specific instance, when we're talking about what's going on in a firm or anything like that, we're actually talking about a quantitative relationship. And so that's what we mean when we say workers can self-exploit.
Angie makes a good point here. Capitalism, like all class modes of production, is predicated on production for exchange, in which to get what they need, workers must always produce above and beyond what is necessary. Capitalism does this in a unique fashion, such that speaking of surplus value in different modes of production is nonsense. So, undoing the kinds of relations which make this extraction possible or necessary would mean, well, abolishing class socialism.
Just to touch on what Dolphin asked earlier when he was going, oh, but would the worker decide, oh, I'm going to exploit myself? The issue is that due to capitalist competition, constant reinvestment into like new automation and new, what Marx, I believe, called constant capital, is required in order to compete. So it's not that the worker sets out to exploit themselves. They simply have no choice. It's a feature of how the capitalist system works.
I more meant that in a democratic workplace, would the workers, because I heard someone said that the workers could exploit themselves or each other. How would this happen?
Well, exploitation we simply mean in a very we're not attaching ethical things to it. It's just simply
No, it's a material argument.
It's simple. The typical structure of a co-op is you take a wage, which is typical, and then you democratically vote on what to do with the profits. I'm saying it in inverted quotes. But the point is still there that these profits, these bits of surplus value, aren't directly going to the worker because some of it has to be reinvested into the constant capital.
In a Marxist society, the quote unquote profits would be the surplus value, but it would still be democratic, but it wouldn't be used in money. Would a Marxist society is one that is moneyless, correct?
The thing when we talk about a Marxist society is talking about profits is, I think, a little flawed, because generally the idea in a Marxist society is to abolish the commodity form.
Yes.
And we're getting into something quite complicated that I think is a bit beyond this.
All right. Yeah, one step at a time. This is the thing with Marxist theory. You can get so far into it, because there's so many deep topics to it. And then you don't know where you are.
And the other side to that is it goes back to the relationships at play. So we're never actually talking about a single thing in isolation. We have to, in a certain sense, just conversationally, and try to keep things short and simple. But just about any topic that's been brought up here can really be a conversation unto itself in a lot of ways.
I'll move on to the next question here. The second item we were looking at was Crisis and Openings: Introduction to Marxism by Richard Wolff. In this video, he was basically going into, in more detail, the relations of capitalist production and talking about the development of capitalism in America, specifically to demonstrate those. So the first question is, complete this sentence. Surplus value, profit, is the difference between wages and what?
The value of produced commodities.
Labour?
I wrote the value added by the workers' labour.
Yeah, wages and labour, I'd say.
This is another area where Wolff tends to simplify it for the purposes of intelligibility by people who are new to the area. I'll read out my answer, and again, you can see what you think of it. I've written, there are a number of ways to complete this sentence, but Wolff's term is productivity, the amount of total value the worker creates, which can be visualized as the value created by workers minus wages equals profit. And this is a simplified version. Obviously, whenever we're looking at political economy, we'll go into more detail than this. But it communicates the basic idea of wealth being created by workers and workers being estranged from that value that they're creating.
There was a video MSFD shared with me earlier today on Marx's theory of crisis that broke the surplus value down in terms of the working day, and I found that really, really helpful in getting my head around this concept. I'm gonna put it in the study group chat here, and maybe you can share it when you upload this thing as well.
Yeah, just to add to that real quick so people get a sense of it. One way to think about it, and one way a lot of economists, when studying Marx and applying his analysis of capitalism, is they break it down in terms of the working day. And when you do that, the idea here is that you can actually split up the working day between two sides, one being the amount of labor you do that produces enough value to cover your wages. And then after that, you actually continue to work, and that work that you do is the surplus value that gets extracted in the production process. And it's that surplus value that's going to eventually lead to profit, but also feed into other portions of the capitalist system.
Okay, I'll just read out the next question. What effect does a labour surplus, as Wolff calls it, or in Marxist terms, the army of reserve labour, have on wages?
It produces a downwards pressure on wages.
In addition to putting downward pressure on wages, it also gives the capitalist class as a whole, individually and as a whole, an internal political pressure against the working class. So if you try to organize a union, for example, you can simply fire all of those workers and bring in members of the reserve army, the unemployed or unemployed workers, into the firm and have them work at the wages that, or maybe even less than the wages that the workers were having before. So it allows this political pressure to suppress the working class.
And adding on to that, it gives the ability of them to sort of easily divide the working class, because if they have a limited amount of employment, they can employ the people that are more willing to work and less, say, aggravated by working conditions or wages or anything like that. And you can see that, for example, with early immigration into the United States, how there had been established worker unionism in the United States, but then when a wave of immigrants came through, they they were more willing to work for lower wages, and so that created an antagonism between the native workers and immigrants, and so that way they were able to divide the working class, and so the labor unions adopted the ideology of nativism, which is like reactionary sort of nationalism.
Sounds about right. And my answer is essentially basically the same in another way. I'll just read it out. A large number of unemployed people means a lot of competition for the available jobs. The more competition there is for jobs, and the more desperately the unemployed need those jobs, the more cheaply the available workers will sell their labour power. It is also easier for capitalists to undermine unions. They can more easily replace workers who try to fight for higher wages with ones who they believe will not. Unemployment forces wages down. In that way, wages are always forced down basically to subsistence. There's essentially a limit below which wages really can't go for the sake of the capitalist, and that limit is the actual cost of keeping the labourer alive and reproducing the working class. In other words, creating more workers, sustaining the worker's family. I'll read out Ng's point. To expand on MSFD's and Kite's point, newly integrated workers who would, in the long term, benefit from a movement against capital, say a movement against nationalism, may vote for the right and make immigration harder so the surplus working class doesn't increase. And that's a good point. Sometimes a rightward shift can be motivated by that fear in the working class, because the reality is that under capitalism, it is true that immigration results essentially in broadly the compression of wages. The important thing to note as a socialist and in terms of organising against it is that regardless of that, there's really no way to fight it except with the unity of the working class. Acid says, is this at least part of the reason why wages fail to keep up with inflation? Does anyone want to have a go at that?
I would say it's certainly a part of the reason. You have this internal pressure that keeps wages low, and going back to what was said earlier, makes it so any working class activity to push them higher is essentially infeasible at the kind of localized level of the firm.
Captain ACAB also points out there are also political reasons for this, in the sense that there's direct political opposition to increases in wages beyond just the reserve army.
I just wanted to say that regarding the Reserve Army of Labor, a good sort of fictional depiction of that is in Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle, where they describes the employment of workers in the Chicago meatpacking industry. Like, for example, they were like training. They were like training people how to do meatpacking stuff, and it's like those people are the same people that would eventually replace them, and it's sort of like they're training the whole town how to do meatpacking, but only a portion of them will be employed.
Upholder raises a good point, that one thing that gets glossed over with respect to low wages is the price of household goods. Cheap food and clothes can tie in with low wages for the people who buy those goods. So effectively, they're talking about real wages there, and how wages are effectively relative to the cost of living.
So that's like the kind of distinction people make when they talk about living wages or wages in real terms, as opposed to just the numerical value.
The next thing we were looking at was excerpts from the ABCs of Socialism by Jacobin magazine. I suppose there are mixed feelings about Jacobin, but I find, generally speaking, that this guide does clear up a lot of misconceptions, or answers a lot of frequently asked questions. So the first question that we're going to look at is, what is the difference between the welfare state and socialism? This is quite a big one.
I mean, the most obvious difference immediately is that any form of welfare state is just a nicer form of capitalism, whereas socialism is the movement towards the abolition of capitalism.
We live in a time when claims abound on the internet, in particular, that just about anything a government does is socialism, and not only healthcare, but things like fire departments and garbage disposal. As the text points out, Bernie Sanders, in spite of his relative merits, has kind of added to this confusion, as he's been actively equating government with socialism. He's buying into and building on something that's been happening in particularly American society for a long time. Although I think it's good that the text also points out how bad a strategy this is in the US, where you have a population that a large section of is kind of reflexively anti-state. And there's also the fact that the state does things that socialists obviously would not defend. A lot of things, like the repression of workers and killing activists and what have you.
There's the added problem that because these are band-aids to a much more fundamental problem, when those band-aids are exposed as not long-term solutions. So when we see social democratic policies fail, then that failure is placed against socialism as a whole, rather than what it was originally, band-aids for capitalism.
A pro-capitalist state, or as we would call it, a bourgeois state, has to fulfill certain functions regardless of its ideological orientation, simply because there are certain conditions that have to be met in order for capitalism to function. capitalism requires roads, it needs an able-bodied, literate workforce, and of course, paramount is the fact that they need their businesses to be protected as their private property. There's an issue with reforms being in themselves not necessarily beneficial to the working class, or not necessarily primarily structured to benefit workers. For example, if you look at tax credits and Medicare, these can also be interpreted, while they have no doubt provided some relief to workers, as subsidies to low-wage employers and to pharmaceutical companies, in that the expansion of Medicaid was also a massive expansion of the health insurance industry. And the reason for this is that economic power essentially translates into political power. And I don't think anyone listening really needs to be persuaded of that, because at this point it's so obvious, it's just kind of beyond a joke, that the so-called billionaire class can easily undermine any semblance of popular democracy by simply buying the system, and that's not even touching upon their ideological control of society.
I actually have a question, and I feel like maybe a silly question just because, like, I feel like this probably answered in Capital or something like that. But when we're talking about surplus value created by the workers that is then turned into profit, is this that surplus value use value or exchange value, or that's not necessarily the point?
It's definitely not use value, because doesn't use value not really have a quantitative representation, really?
Surplus value would be the sum total of exchange value that occurs after a product or a commodity has been produced and sold on the market.
Okay, just to kind of shift back to the other question about the difference between socialism and the welfare state, I think we should try to summarise that question. Essentially, socialism is a different mode of production to capitalism. The reality is that under capitalism, these reforms can always be engineered to benefit capitalists as opposed to workers. And as long as the economic basis of society remains such, there is no actual emancipation for workers. Socialism, I suppose, at an economic level, you would say alienated labour no longer exists under socialism. Capital no longer exists under socialism. So the capital that is essentially being put into providing social services under capitalism can't be described as socialism, even though the class tensions of capitalism generate the movements which demand these reforms.
I think the other point about these kind of reforms is that quite often they are very temporary. When we get into serious crises, quite often these reforms are stripped back.
Yeah, we're very much seeing that right now. Essentially, the neoliberal capitalist establishment is trying to claw back as much as it can with austerity measures.
And welfare specifically is kind of interesting because it's pretty directly related to the last item, because welfare would not exist without there being a reserve army of labor of people who cannot be employed, as well as the effect that the labor surplus has on lowering wages to the point that sometimes people can't afford basic necessities.
Okay, the next question is, what is the special role of workers in capitalist society that places them at the centre of socialist theory and strategies?
The idea is that all value is created by labour, And as such, the labourers, the workers, are the creators of all value within the capitalist system.
Just to clarify, labour creates all new value that is not pre-existing in nature.
Yeah, in a sense, it places them a bit at the center because they are responsible for, this system's ability to keep reproducing itself. And if they were to stop producing that value, then the system itself would collapse.
One thing that I remember hearing about, especially in regards to the workers' place in capitalism, and this may be somewhat of a pedantic point, but I do wonder how much this distinction really matters, because I've heard of people saying it's not necessarily like labor as in like the physical act of labor that creates value, but insofar as the ability to labor is the thing that creates value. I'm just wondering, does that distinction matter? And if so, why?
I believe that officially what the worker sells is their ability to labour. It is labour, though, that does the actual creation of value.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the reason Marx makes that distinction is because the classical economics economists said that the worker sells their labor, but Marx revealed that actually the worker doesn't get paid the full value of their labor, so he says labor power.
I feel the other distinction from labour power and the individual's labour is that labour power is like an average function of, every labourer involved in the capital process. It's not like specific to how good that one person is at their job. It's, when we're talking about the definition of labour, it's very strict on the socially necessary labour time and not necessarily the actual hours that went into it. If you spend 4 hours making something that usually only takes 2 hours to make, its value is only going to be based on that 2 hours and not the 4 hours you spent.
Part of the reason for this distinction, and it actually ties together with what Marx means when he talks about what a commodity actually is there is, yes, human beings have the ability to labor, but that in and of itself is not a commodity. In the same way, Marx makes this distinction. He doesn't use this example, but he makes this distinction that when I produce tomatoes in my garden, I say I have a garden and I grow some tomatoes in it, and I harvest the tomatoes and I make a meal and I eat them. I've not actually produced value in the sense that that usually matters to capitalism. The reason is that I'm not putting them into the exchange process. So those tomatoes in and of themselves are not commodities unless they are produced for exchange. Because once that occurs, then they are now involved in the broader market dynamics that matters to capitalism. And there's a whole load of topics that are wrapped up in that. But that draws back to this distinction between labor and labor power. Labor in and of itself is not a commodity. I can grow tomatoes in my garden. I can build a fence. I can perform productive or creative acts that aren't necessarily relevant to capitalism. But my ability to labor is the commodity that I sell on the market. So my ability to build a fence might be a commodity to somebody in the fact that I have the labor power to do it. And that's why that distinction is there.
Just as an aside as well, because we're obviously going to get the mud pie argument come up when we talk about labour as the source of all value. At least in my abridged version of Capital, which I have here, Marx clearly makes the distinction that for an object to have value, it does need a use value in order for, the exchange value to make sense. And as he said, if the thing is useless, so is the labour contained within it, and hence the labour does not count as labour and therefore creates no value. And that he's saying that labour in the capitalist sense is a very specific producing useful objects for exchange, as opposed to, like the colloquial use of the term.
And I think it was when it was mentioned earlier, when someone mentioned use value earlier, I said it wasn't quantitative. There, it's actually qualitative. The thing is, it's actually qualitative. It just determines whether or not labor process becomes useful and can create, well, quantitative value.
Just to jump off of that for a second, within Marx and a lot of Marxists and economists following him, use value is essentially treated as an assumption that is realized in the act of exchange. The idea being that a commodity is something that has a use value to somebody. And the way we realize that in concrete terms is that somebody's willing to pay for it. It is simply just taken as given that there are objects of utility out there and people want them. And if they buy them, then in this whole otherwise process, it is a commodity in some sense. Now, that's stretching that term a little bit, but when we talk about use value, that's essentially what is meant. It is just that somebody has a useful, a commodity has this property of being a useful object to somebody.
So what determines use value, I guess what I can gather from that is ultimately something that is determined in a lot of ways by social forces.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points he made was when he's talking about the classic 20 yards of linen equals one coat thing. You can have like a change in the exchange value without the use value of the commodity changing. They're like two very separate things within a commodity. For example, like if you suddenly get more automation, I mean, you could have the point where 20 yards of linen equals two coats instead. But obviously, like the use value of the coats is essentially doubled. You've got two coats. That's enough for two people instead of just one. But its exchange value has dropped because the amount of social necessary labor time to produce it is less.
It's why in the same section, and it's a very long section, and because he's trying to draw out a lot of these different points and distinctions, it's also a very boring section. But putting that aside, he makes the point to Maoist Dago's point that in the production process of linen, at some point, new technology was introduced that allowed linen to be produced at double the amount of time it was, double the amount of linen in the same amount of time as before. And once this technology spreads throughout the marketplace, the individual seamstress, their value is now affected by this spread of technology throughout the entire marketplace. So if they continue to produce linen in the same way as before, the value of their product is still cut in half, even though they are putting the same amount of labor they've been putting in before the technology was introduced.
Okay, I'm just going to swing back to that question and sort of read out my answer, which is very much in the context of the actual text. Socialists don't orient towards workers for moral reasons, so it's not that we have particular love for workers, although sometimes that is the case, but primarily for strategic reasons. It's impossible to achieve a socially just world within a system where the majority of people are socially dominated and economically exploited. The system itself is unjust. But it should be pointed out that this struggle doesn't originate in the ideals of justice, fairness, or equality, although those are words that workers themselves use, and when workers use them, they have different implications to when capitalists use them. But they originate in the workers' material conditions, which prompt the workers to notice inequality and pursue their economic interests as a class. And there's a quote here that essentially summarises, "The working class has this power for a simple reason. Capitalists can only make their profits if workers show up to work every day, and if they refuse to play along, the profits dry up overnight. This ability to crash the entire system just by refusing to work gives workers a kind of leverage that no other group in society has. It is of central importance to organise workers so that they can use that power. There was something, however, that was I felt missing from this text, which I think is also important to point out, that struggles on the basis of race or gender are not mutually exclusive to class struggle. On the contrary, they are part of the same struggle, because these oppressed groups actually constitute the working class itself. The majority of workers are both exploited and oppressed along the lines of race, gender, sexuality, and so on. And the reason I think that's important is because a kind of faulty conception of the class as this homogenous mass can lead to very strange orientations and, in my view, dodgy positions.
Just to give an example of this, we saw a historical example of this in Karl Marx's own life. Genius that he was very class reductionist in his lifetime, and wrote extensively that after the end of the American Civil War, he wanted the International Workingmen's Association to focus on organizing the white male proletariat, because he simply did not believe that women or freedmen counted as proletarians and could not count as proletarians.
I think it's very dangerous to alienate what are the most militant sections of society. Even when capitalism is not in crisis, those groups are still pursuing particular interests, albeit they may not have class orientations inherently. But the role of the socialist is really not to reject those struggles. The role of the socialist is to incorporate those struggles and explain how it's possible to actually achieve justice, which is the goal of those struggles.
If I can add one extra thing on here that I've always found, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's definitely related to this. There's a tendency among some Marxists that I've read, especially those who I won't go that direction, but there's a tendency among some Marxists that I've read to take Marx's distinction between productive and unproductive labor, which is again a distinction he makes, and it's not really the point here, but for quantitative reasons, and to use that and say that, well, service sector workers cannot be revolutionary, or we should not focus on them for revolutionary potential because they do not produce surplus value. And I think to a lot of people here, that's just frankly kind of ridiculous at face value, because simply because a fast food worker, for example, may not produce surplus value in the traditional sense, it does not mean that they aren't still under the same kinds of conditions that would put them into a revolutionary potential. They are still feeling the worst of the worst effects of capitalism in their daily life, and plenty of them are radical, and we've seen fights for these groups of people on that economic front. But I bring that up just simply how these kinds of distinctions often, when people take them too far, lead to, as Trumbull put it, dodgy positions in practice.
I would also add to that sort of thing strikes me as a failure to really think in class terms. It's the working class that collectively is exploited. It is the exploited class. It's impossible to reduce an analysis of capitalism to individual workers, essentially. And I mean, there are also arguments to be made that part of the production line of commodities today involves service work.
Yeah, I was about to bring up that point. It seems to really fetishize a commodity as a physical object instead of all like the attached things to that object. I mean, when you're sold like a ticket to see a stage show, you're not being given like any physical commodity, but the commodity is still there. There's still entertainment, there's these actions. I feel like that's a misunderstanding of what commodities are, and that they think it's only physical objects.
and that these physical objects are only produced by the mythical. Mythical is the wrong term, but the white male industrial worker who is the only proletarian that officially counts.
I think the point is not about commodification existing in objects that have use value. It's about the commodification of labor power, which exists in both whether the laborer is creating commodities in surplus value or whether they're more directly sort of being, or whether their labor power is more directly being sort of used.
Okay, I think we've covered that to a satisfactory degree. The next question is based on Principles of Communism by Frederick Engels. What makes someone proletarian? Is a doctor proletarian?
I'd say the definition of proletarian is based on the relationship to the means of production, in that the proletarian is typically someone who, in order to reproduce themselves, feed themselves, clothe themselves, all those wonderful things, their only like sizable asset is their labor power. So they are compelled to sell their labor power in order to keep themselves alive, essentially. Whereas someone who is bourgeois can just essentially sit back on property and these sorts of things.
Yeah, the question is sort of a misnomer because the sort of division of labor, what an industry, say, is necessarily involved in, doesn't say anything about class relations. It's just the way in which the production process operates. Whatever the production process is doing, that determines the class relations.
What I'd say is that a doctor can be proletarian, but say if the doctor receives enough in wages that they then invest in property and other sorts of things, then there's definitely like a qualitative leap there from the proletariat class to the petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to the point about the question. The reason it was phrased that way is precisely because under a sort of liberal conception of class, a doctor is very much not proletarian. It's distinct to a Marxist understanding of class that we would say, yes, a doctor actually is, as a wage labourer who has to continue selling their ability to labour in order to buy the means of survival. Yes, they are still proletarian. They're a well-paid member of the proletariat. I did also, in my answer, make the same point that Maoist Doggo just made, that if a doctor were to save a lot of money and use it to purchase a business, and provided they were able to live on the profits, their economic class would have changed. They would not be proletarian anymore. And that also raises another point which is often used to kind of muddy the waters, where you have a situation where working class people maybe own some pretty negligible stocks or shares or whatever. My grandmother, for example, owned, like, she used to invest in this sort of thing. She was working class, like she didn't make anything like enough off of those investments to actually live on them. And I think, in a way, that can be used as a kind of ideological tool, because then the capitalist can turn around and say, oh, well, if it's based purely in your relationship to the means of production and you own stocks and shares, well, you're not proletarian anymore, are you?
I mean, that was definitely a thing before the Great Depression and stuff, encouraging working class people to invest in the stock market as kind of a we're all capitalists now kind of push. And this was definitely brought back during Thatcherite Britain as well. This idea that, the poor are there because they deserve it, they've made bad decisions, we're all actually middle class, you should invest, we should do this, we should do that, completely ignoring any systemic issues as just a ideological excuse to cut the welfare state.
how do people here define petty bourgeois?
That's a good question, and it also calls into question how Marx defined petty bourgeois. He did, in a sense, include not only small business owners, but also some workers who act on behalf of the capitalist class, basically as proxies of the capitalist, like managers and so on, by virtue of their consciousness not being in line with a general working class consciousness, and in the sense that they can tend to identify their interests incorrectly with the interests of the capitalist class. But the crucial point there is that it's still incorrect for them to be really identifying with the capitalist class, because ultimately they are still wage workers. They are still a member of the antagonistic class, objectively speaking. But there are ideological issues there as well.
How I think I've usually understood it as is that the petty bourgeoisie are defined by controlling capital, but also doing productive labor sort of at the same time. Doing productive labor that isn't like the extremely small percentage of the value that they collect from the process.
I mean, the thing is that if you look at a manager, for example, who doesn't really do anything other than oversee what other workers are doing, on an individual level, they're not involved directly in creating the commodity or whatever it is. However, they are still selling their ability to labour, they're still selling their labour power, and they're compelled to sell their labour power in order to buy the means of survival. They don't have any independent income that would relieve them of that compulsion.
Yeah, I think with management, you could look at the activity of managing in sort of two different ways. You could say that it could be labor, it could be actually productive labor that's just sort of spread out, that's more indirect, that's sort of spread out around the production of sort of mini commodities. Like if you figure out how to make something more efficiently, then it might add to the collective value. Or you could say that it's just purely management of social relations. Like if you're managing like wages and stuff, then definitely that's a bourgeois form of just doing quote unquote labor that's just representative of social relations and not actually producing commodity or value.
I mean, I believe the way Marx defined it, and I know someone will correct me if I'm wrong, is that the petty bourgeois tend to be distinct from the proletariat in that they do they don't just have their labour power to survive, they do have like a stake in the means of production and hence do employ proletariat and buy the labour power, but they tend to work alongside the proletariat in managing these I can't think of the term all of a sudden, but you get my point. Unlike the bourgeois who literally just, buy the labour of the worker, the petty bourgeois has this position of both simultaneously working with the proletariat while also purchasing their labour power.
I think another interesting thing to think about is the actual nature of the petty bourgeoisie itself in relation to where its class interests objectively lie. I mean, in the class struggles in France, Marx makes some very interesting observations about the ways in which people who are undeniably petty bourgeoisie are compelled essentially by the bourgeoisie proper in a lot of important ways. I'll see if I can sort of paraphrase this without going on too long about it. This is a quote. "No one had fought more fanatically in the June days for the salvation of property and the restoration of credit than the Parisian petty bourgeois, keepers of cafes and restaurants, wine merchants, small traders, shopkeepers, handicraftsmen, etc. The shopkeeper had pulled himself together and marched against the barricades in order to restore the traffic leading to his shop. But behind the barricades stood the customers and the debtors. Before it, the creditors of the shop. So when the barricades are thrown down, and the workers were crushed, and the shopkeepers, drunk with victory, rushed back to their shops, they found the entrance barred by a saviour of property, an official agent of credit, who presented them with threatening notices: overdue promissory note, overdue house rent, overdue bond, doomed shopkeeper. Salvation of property, but the house they lived in was not their property, the shop they kept was not their property, the commodities they dealt in were not their property. Restoration of credit, but credit, having regained strength, proved itself a vigorous and jealous god. It turned the debtor who could not pay out of his four walls, together with his wife and child, surrendered his sham property to capital, and threw the man himself into the debtor's prison." So essentially it's interesting because yes, the petty bourgeoisie do have contradictory class interests, their loyalties are divided. But with that, he's essentially pointing out that there is no other force in society capable of relieving the petty bourgeoisie from this prison of debt to big capital or finance capital than the proletariat and the movement for socialism. So ultimately their class interests do and should align with those of the proletariat.
I mean, we can get into a big discussion here as well in the role of the petty bourgeoisie in fascism, but I feel like that's a topic for another time.
The thing is that in determining like whether someone belongs to a certain class, it's sort of quantitative because they can act in a way that belongs to a certain class. They can do work and also invest in things, but determining the individual sort of allocation of where they lie class-wise has to be based on a quantitative observation of what their income is based on. So if you do mostly work but buy a few bonds, then you're not bourgeois, you're still a proletarian.
Has there always been a working class? Why or why not?
I think that I would say no, in the sense of the term we usually mean. Essentially, it's a class relative to capitalism. There have always been people dispossessed of property and rights, of course, all throughout history. But when we talk about working class, we mean something historically specific.
I mean, there have always been, oppressed and the oppressor, but in previous kind of means of production, the relationship between the two classes was very different. I mean, if you look at the relationship between peasantry and the aristocracy, it's very different to how the working class interacts with the bourgeoisie. It's very much tied into a very instead of like this kind of extraction of labor kind of thing and wages, it's tied into being allowed to live on certain parts of land and those sort of things.
I'd say no, the working class has not always existed because class has not always existed.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends how you actually define working class, and Engels does actually make the point that there have always been classes who have worked as long as there's been class society, classes who produce surplus and a class who appropriates the surplus. But in the sense that we use it today to mean the proletariat, of course, the proletariat is specific to capitalism, and in that sense it came into existence alongside capitalism as the dominant mode of production, whereas Engels cites during the Industrial Revolution.
I mean, one of the greatest examples that, previous oppressed classes aren't the same as the proletariat. You look at the structures of revolutions where there was still a significant peasant population, such as the Chinese Revolution. And you can see how those classes interacted differently. And there's plenty of writing about how, where their interests align, where they differ, those sort of things.
What I'm thinking of in terms of this question is sort of early, like hunter-gatherer tribal societies, the so-called primitive communism, where there may have been sort of patriarchal relations or somewhat, but there definitely wasn't a class divide. It's just sort of everyone collecting food and surviving pretty much without much division of labor.
Sometimes they weren't actually patriarchal, sometimes they were, as sociologists would now call it, matrilineal.
Yeah, especially in a lot of old hunter-gatherer societies, men and women both did pretty much equal amounts of work. I mean, you can even see this now of men perhaps going on the hunt for some of the more special meat or something like that, but the women otherwise getting all of like the basic necessities necessary. So in a lot of ways, they basically all pulled their own weight for the work.
And sort of in a technical way, in answering the question, you might want to say, is that a situation where everyone is the working class or where no one is the working class because there's not a division with some other class?
I mean, the point is, I feel that the very concept of the working class, as in the proletariat, is very specific to the capitalist mode of production. And to make these comparisons, we kind of have to be a little nebulous with our definitions and very unspecific.
I'll just read out some comments that have been made here by Comrade Crop Potato. Patriarchal relations historically originate from the agricultural revolution. Matrilineal can be patriarchal, because matrilineal means descent is traced through the mother's line. Often matrilineal societies have the brother of the mother as a political figure. So the next thing we were looking at is Socialism, Utopian, Scientific, Chapter 1, Utopian Socialism. This is essentially a fairly brief overview of essentially pre-Marxist socialist theories and how they led to or contributed to the development of Marxism, but crucially how they differ from Marxism. And although these are pre-Marxist ideas, it's not like they've completely vanished from society. In fact, we still see instances of what I'm sure Engels might call utopian socialism in society today. The first question is, why were the earliest socialists utopian?
The way I've always characterized it when people ask that kind of question is when you look at what are termed the early utopian socialists, they often came at it with a moral indignation against capitalism, and then essentially from there just tried to wrestle a different kind of production process. But you'd see the early American Christians who would essentially create a township based around what we would now essentially call cooperatives.
You mean like Puritans?
Yeah, I can't believe I'm
Amish?
blanking on their name.
The Pilgrims?
I believe they were the Shakers, weren't they?
Yeah. But the broader point here being is that they came at it without any actual analysis of how capitalism worked or came to be.
I mean, we can approach this question from multiple directions. so to speak. I mean, I definitely feel like one of the big differences between utopian forms of socialism and Marxist scientific socialism is their conception and analysis, and that utopian socialism is quite often based on an idealist analysis, as opposed to Marx's Marx and Engels's materialist conception of how things happen.
They were utopian because they based their socialism on, quote, the idealized kingdom of reason, end quote. That is the ideological superstructure of capitalist society. They want to get rid of the dystopian aspects of society without an understanding of how the economic system created those conditions and antagonistic classes. They thought that pure reason and justice would rule the world if only humanity would understand and follow those principles correctly. They want a kind of messiah and do not recognise the basis of emancipation from capitalism as existing within capitalism and as having been created by it. The French Revolution embodied this reasoning but failed to purge society of injustice, inequality, irrationality. It founded a bourgeois republic and heightened class antagonisms.
I feel like that's a much more fleshed out explanation of what I meant by the difference between the idealistic approach and the materialist approach.
Why were the earliest socialists utopian? Well, if you think about what the word utopian means, it means a place that cannot exist or a state of society that cannot exist. And that's quite true in this case because what the early socialists did was they attempted to create their idea of socialism within like a capitalist framework. For example, Plymouth, Massachusetts as sort of socialist or something like that. That might not entirely be correct, but like I've heard it said before that they were communist and sort of in a propagandist way. It's like they tried to do communism and they failed. That's why they starved and all. But what happened was that they created a settlement through this company and they had to serve this company when they created the settlement. They had to, the capital, although the resources that they needed to start it in the very first place came from this structure with this company. And so they're trying to create a society that's based on these ideals, but it's through the means of a productive process that is antagonistic to those ideals.
It's a good answer. Okay, I'll just go ahead and read the next question out. And sorry if I do not pronounce this name correctly. It's French. So, in what way did Saint-Simon's conception of class differ from Engels' idea of nobility, bourgeoisie, and proletariat?
So his conception of class wasn't based on any relation to the means of production. It was based on an idea of those who worked and those who did not. It was completely irrelevant of any like material context. Simply if you worked and that's how you made your living, you were one class, and if you did not work and were still able to reproduce yourself, you were another class. Merchants, for example, were the working class in his like idealized version of this. If you were like what we would consider, petty bourgeois, you were a worker in his eyes. You were part of the working class, and it was this different idea of what the class struggle was based on and where it was based.
Yeah, so Engels does point out that essentially the working class as we know it today, the proletariat, hadn't fully developed at this stage, and therefore neither had the socialists' theories. They were crude in that sense. The means by which an ideal society was to be achieved, according to Saint-Simon, were by models and propaganda. So isolated sort of model societies and essentially proselytizing, spreading the message. And as you've pointed out, Maoist Doggo, the distinction that was drawn was primarily between workers and idlers. But it's significant that the idlers, in his conception, were not merely the old privileged classes, the old sort of aristocrats, but also all of those who essentially lived on their incomes, so the bourgeoisie proper. But it's problematic as well in the sense that his conception of workers included not only wage workers, but also merchants and bankers.
I feel like the other issue there is it doesn't make a conception of whether you have to work to survive or not. So say if you were part of the bourgeois proper and that you didn't require to work at all, but you chose to out of some, some ideal, maybe you read his pamphlet and you think, oh, this is a great idea. Suddenly you've gone to that working class, whereas the conception is false under Marxist analysis.
Yeah, there was also this idea that bankers would be involved in directing social production by regulating credit. And this was kind of symptomatic of a time when the chasm between bourgeoisie and proletariat was only just coming into existence. So the point there is that really he couldn't have predicted the kind of extent to which this would polarize, the extent to which you would have inequality in society.
I mean, I think it makes quite a lot of sense considering the material conditions he was in at the time. He was very much a child of the French Revolution, and with all the, trappings that comes with.
Okay, if no one has anything else to add, I'll just move on to the final question here, and then after we've done that, we can sort of go over any questions that people here have and anything that anyone thinks should be involved in the recording that we haven't kind of touched on, but is relevant at this sort of introductory level. So the question is, Engels heaps praise on Saint-Simon, Fourier and Owen. What exactly does he credit each of them with having achieved?
I believe Simon was the one who, originally came up with the concept of class war. And I believe that's what Engels credited him with, coming up with the concept of.
Whenever I was reading this, I noticed that Engels is really quite complimentary of all of these three socialist utopians, in particular Robert Owen, I suppose because he recognises that they were effectively ahead of their time or symptoms of their time, and their analyses are limited by that. But particularly he credits Saint-Simon with recognising the French Revolution as having been a class war, quote, and not simply one between nobility and bourgeoisie, but between nobility, bourgeoisie, and the non-possessors, which was in the year 1802 a most pregnant discovery. He first expressed the idea of the future conversion of political rule over men into an administration of things and a direction of processes of production. And essentially this amounts to a recognition of class antagonisms or antagonisms between owners and non-owners, and early ideas about the need for some sort of planned economy. Fourier, quote, lays bare remorselessly the material and moral misery of the bourgeois world. He points out the disparity between its philosophical ideas of justice and equality, and says that the most pitiful reality corresponds with the most high-sounding phrases. He was also the first to declare that in any given society, the degree of woman's emancipation is the natural measure of the general emancipation. It's also significant that he was probably the first to understand human society as developing in stages, and he recognised that in each historical stage of development, the antagonisms have just been reproduced without being able to solve them. Engels is like, clearly he really loves Robert Owen because he speaks really glowingly of him. And he says Robert Owen had adopted the teaching of the materialistic philosophers that human beings and human society are the result of their material conditions, genes and environment, especially their period of development. And I'll just give the example that Engels cites, sort of outlining significant events in Owen's life. He directed a cotton mill where he employed the most demoralised elements of society and proved effectively that by placing the people in conditions worthy of human beings, drunkenness and criminality disappeared, and police and charity disappeared along with them. He put children through school, reduced the working day to a mere 10 hours. And of course, 10 hours is a long time to work, but I suppose this is at a time when a 13 or 14-hour working day was usual. And I suppose most importantly, you recognised still that it was far from satisfactory. He recognised that he was still in control and that the proprietors who wanted returns on their investments were acting as a drain on the wealth produced by the workers. The workers did not own the fruits of their labour, and this was essentially the primary obstacle to them having a satisfactory situation. He also developed communist theories which saw private property, religion, and the present form of marriage as obstacles. So he really does appear to have been a genuine predecessor to Marxism, basically.
Robert Owen influenced many actual religious bourgeoisie in the United Kingdom. In the city I live in, Birmingham, if anyone didn't know, there's the Bourneville area, which was owned by the Cadbury family, who adopted a lot of these kind of reforms inspired by Robert Owen, because they saw that what Owen did led to a more productive and happier workforce, and they saw it as something good in society as well.
So are there any questions that maybe anyone who's been listening has sort of had as we've been talking? And you can either say it in voice or just type it in the text chat. Upholder says, so now that we know the finer points of the formal definition of class and surplus value, what's the next natural topic to learn about? Over the next few weeks, I've got some things lined up that will kind of build on what we've discussed today. So we'll be looking at political economy, we'll be looking at the theory of history, a little bit more philosophy, and following on from that, we'll start to learn about how other struggles like feminist struggles and anti-racist struggles or black liberation sort of tie into class struggle more generally. We will actually have a week on class struggle itself.
I do have a question, however, I'm currently on the subway, so I'm being in and out right now, so bear with me.
What Upholder just asked is, everyone on the left theoretically knows about class and value, at least at the level we've now discussed. What are the causes for reaction and revisionism within the left? I feel like there are many different explanations for this, and there's many different depending on what tendencies you ask as well. But in terms of the rejection of identity politics, which is quite a common topic at the minute, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how these struggles relate to the class struggle. They simply take the liberal idea that all these are separate struggles and should be dealt with separately, instead of seeing them all as elements of one struggle. Or they go the other way and say, oh, but they're all the class struggles, so if we just solve this class thing, it'll all be fine, missing the point that by doing this, they're not really fighting for the entire working class, and hence not struggling on a class basis. They're just representing the white proletariat, generally speaking.
Yeah, like it's a failure to recognize these things as endemic to capitalism in exactly the same way that class oppression is. Capitalism creates more than one type of oppression. So there is no overthrow of capitalism without the liberation of all of those oppressed groups as well as an inherent part of it. It's part of the revolution. There is no revolution without liberation, emancipation. I mean, I think we have to look for the causes of revisionism and reaction in the same place where we look for the source of all ideology under capitalism and during any mode of production for that matter. The causes of both of those things are first and foremost material. Material conditions are continually regulating those ideas. I think this is a particularly pertinent question for a lot of people who are interested in socialism, but have questions about the USSR. I mean, if we take one instance of what I would call Stalinist reaction, let's say the ban on abortion, an anti-materialist or idealist interpretation of this is that Marxism itself is ideologically reactionary and oppressive. If, on the other hand, we look at the material context of the abortion ban, not to apologise for it, of course, we see simultaneously insufficient populations of workers for the development that would have been necessary to even create the conditions for socialism, combined with high numbers of homeless or abandoned children who the state was materially too poor to look after. And these factors were part of over-determining the ideological push under Stalinism to reinstate the nuclear family as the primary unit of reproductive labour. I mean, it's no coincidence that the ideologues of capitalism also take the position that domestic and care work should be heaped on the nuclear family, specifically women, as opposed to being socialised. But the ideological component of reaction or revisionism also, it can't be overlooked. Lenin wrote in 1913 demanding the unconditional annulment of all laws against abortions or against the distribution of medical literature on contraceptive measures. This is a Marxist position, and yet we still have today the literal revision of history claiming that this ban was a measure to protect women's health. And incidentally, conservative commentators today are still pulling this one. The reality is that today we still have capitalism, and our Marxism still exists in a sea of bourgeois ideology, in the same way that the USSR was surrounded on all sides by immensely powerful capitalist states. So we're confronted with the need to constantly apply Marxism to our own Marxism, to our positions and our assumptions. And to me, that is the kernel of Trotskyism.
I find this particularly disturbing when Maoist groups get this wrong, especially since, like, the feminist branch of, the Maoist branch of Marxist feminism stresses this so well, in that it regards women's liberation as such a central part of the class struggle.
Just to read what NG had to say to this question as well. NG says, it also has to do with the heterogeneity of the class. Proletarians who are not otherwise oppressed won't be positively interested in movements against oppression and may be poised to act against them. It is revisionism due to the fact they can't posit class-wide praxis.
Yeah, and sort of to describe that materially, the just sort of raw sort of proletarian interest is, of course, because of just the population of the world overwhelmingly being proletarian, is possible for any average person to grasp, but other frameworks of oppression or whatever might not be necessarily affect the majority of people. So
yeah, we will be visiting these topics in hopefully a lot more detail. Are there any other questions?
Upholder asked after the last question, what are Marxists talking about when they say that class struggle is a force that drives history, history with a capital H?
That's a good question. I suppose whenever we conceive of history in terms of stages of development, we also have to recognise the existence of antagonistic classes within those historical periods of development. And we have to recognise progress from one to the next as symptomatic of the conditions created by the former. The revolutionary class in any historical period is created by the conditions of that historical period, and its struggle for emancipation or for its own conception of freedom from the existing order of oppression is what produces the next historical period.
I would add to that, one of the more interesting points about it in terms of utilizing class struggle as a driver or of history, history proper, is that we can see how the internal contradictions have developed in previous class societies and how they break down over time, or what their limitations are, or how they arrive to us in new ways. A good example of this is in certain forms of feudalism. There's an exact name for it, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. The division of work among serfs would be that they work a certain amount of time on the land, and that product goes to the aristocracy, and the rest they keep. But what's interesting here is that it is not wildly different from what we talk about in terms of the working day under capitalism. But what's interesting and what's different about it concretely is the relationship to the means of production and how surplus is extracted under that system. So you may work directly with the land for 3 days to produce for the aristocracy and then 3 days to produce for your family. But you are working directly for the land or on the land, and you are keeping the product that you produce in very direct terms, and are very directly giving away the product of your work to somebody else for 3 days. And under capitalism, we see it in this new form of the working day. You do work a certain amount of time to produce value that equates to your wages, and then a surplus on top of that. But it is disguised by the very fact that you do not own and you do not live on the means of production that you are using to produce that value. It is, in a very abstract way, very similar, but we can see very concrete qualitative differences between them and how they've changed over centuries.
Okay, I will read out Crumbly's question here. I started thinking about, in general, a kind of antagonism that occurs between workers and customers that I see often from people in the service industry. There was a point made earlier that when a lot of conservative governments tried to push for a campaign of workers owning stocks, that was, in a way, a means to obfuscate the class division between proletariat and bourgeoisie. I feel like some workers can, in a sense, feel that same obfuscation if they're a service worker, since one doesn't just buy a hamburger but the luxury of not having to make that hamburger yourself. You even get antagonism, even more pushed, with customers essentially feeling like it's okay to abuse workers just for doing their job. In a sense, workers can almost feel like customers are bourgeois. We always say the customer is always right, for instance, as a part of our systemic ideology. The first question is, how does this antagonism arise and how is it upheld? correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the antagonism you're talking about essentially is one that exists between the worker, the service worker, and the consumer, or the worker as consumer. Although they are ostensibly a part of the working class, it creates an antagonism within the working class to have this kind of ideology.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So I'm not sure about the example of like putting together a hamburger, because I'm not sure that is service work, because it still involves putting productive labor on a commodity and the value being represented in that physical commodity. But the essential question, I think, is, let's say in the productive process that is not, say, service work that involves a commodity, it involves the bourgeoisie buying the labor power and then being applied to means of production and constant capital and producing the surplus value and whatnot. And so there's an antagonism between the person who buys the labor power and the person who has the labor power. And then in labor that is service labor, it's there. It also involves a person who buys labor power and a person who is doing the labor power. The difference is the person that is buying the labor power is sort of consuming the labor power directly instead of using it to generate surplus value.
I think we have to be very strict in what we define as service work as well. Like,
Yeah.
there was talk in the chat about tech support over the phone. But quite often, this idea of having tech support available is part of the commodity package that you're sold when you're given the item you're calling tech support for. As such, I don't think it can be thought of as truly separate
That's
from the initial
exactly what I
commodity.
was about to kind of say. In this dynamic, it's almost as if the worker is a commodity, and of course they are under capitalism. It's a combination of the reification of the worker as part of the commodity, and also the fact that to the consuming public, or to the worker as consumer, you're perceived as a representative of that company, or of the capitalist even.
I think there's one of the aspects of Crumbly's question was also, how does this kind of arise and become a part of more systematic ideology? And I think going back quickly to the example Crumbly used of the production of hamburgers, I think there's an interesting qualitative element. And I'm not sure exactly how to put this into words, but there is a function of, I walk into a shop and I lay down the money to purchase a hamburger, and then a worker produces it for me quite directly. And I think that definitely is something that plays into the production of that ideology, because even though the consumer or the customer is not the capitalist in this situation, they're not the one paying the wages, there is a direct sense of putting down the money to see a worker produce something for me directly. And I think that has a very qualitative effect on how that kind of ideology is produced.
Yeah, like that's the sort of idea I was thinking. It's just that one other aspect where we're constantly told, you vote with your dollar pretty much. And like with that, like as you're basically giving that worker a dollar who then produces you whatever thing that you need, either making you the burger or otherwise like a tech support thing, giving you the service to try to basically figure out what's wrong with something that you just bought. There's this sort of expectation that because I gave you money, therefore you basically need to work as exactly as you're supposed to do in my head, even though essentially, like, that is an incredibly false dichotomy. We are all workers in here. And yeah, and also, I'm starting to draw a blank right now, I'm sorry, but like that was just something I thought was kind of interesting, because you even see this too with movies like Office Space and Clerks, of like basically talking about how, the customers are the enemy in a lot of ways.
And I do think it goes back to Tremble's point about it's the reification of the worker themselves as a part of the commodity that is bought and sold at any given time. And that goes to what you're saying in terms of, well, I've already bought this commodity of which you are now a part of. And so you should work and function exactly as I was told you would work and function.
So I think as far as an example of service work would go, I think probably any kind of entertainment industry be an example of this, because it doesn't really involve physical commodity, even by indirect means like tech
Okay,
service
I'll just go ahead
does.
and read out the second question that Crumbly has posited here. Do you think this is a way society further divides workers, and is it actually significant to the way much of the Western world works now?
In terms of the antagonism between the consumer
I mean,
and the
I would
service
say that
industry
it's
worker, right?
definitely a part of the ideological superstructure of capitalism. And I mean, I'm not going to say the Western world, because also a lot of service jobs like call center work have also been exported to, underdeveloped regions as well. I think it's more generally a part of capitalist ideology.
That's true. It isn't just the Western world. I guess I said more of the Western world, if only just because with a lot of people I talk to, they basically think that industrialization in the United States and in Europe is essentially over. I mean, especially because, a lot of factories are closing. So therefore, you're trying to find basically work in other places, namely Walmart, Target, stores, call centers, that sort of thing. But it's true it isn't just a part of, like, one significant part of the Western world. That does happen everywhere. You are correct in saying that.
I don't think it can really divide workers and as much as other ways can, because it doesn't really create a division outside of, except for the moments of consumption, sort of, because of course we know that for the most part workers are the same people that do most of consumption, and most workers may not be service workers, but it's still not as significant as, say, the division between, like, the proletariat class or the bourgeoisie, or between like national division between workers, because that's definite and not just something that involves a part of the day.
I mean, that is true, but I mean, I think more in my question implied not necessarily, because it implied that really this division isn't necessarily what actually happens, but is more of just like one more aspect of that, like Tremble was saying, that ideological superstructure that basically further divides the working class along these lines of like worker and consumer. But I guess in that, though, it's like, obviously, yeah, socialist revolution, but what are the steps then to get there from this sort of aspect of like of talking to workers, basically essentially trying to say that, look, consumers basically, I mean, the vast majority of the time are also workers, and they also feel that. So I guess in this sense, strategically, would this be something that socialist groups would want to explore a little bit more now? Or is it maybe something that's perhaps it is something that could be explored a little bit, but it's not necessarily like an overall major thing that needs to be strategized over in order to like find a place to get to create genuine worker solidarity, and then later on, obviously, revolution.
I mean, I feel in a lot of cases there still is genuine worker solidarity once you're outside of the dynamic of being served, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, once you're outside of the dynamic of consuming the commodity of the service, there's this idea that, well, I was a little unfair, they're just doing their job. That kind of, like, thought process.
I think it's also a component of what's more generally often called class consciousness, of getting people recognizing that, in a very general sense, that they are workers and that they need to treat each other as workers, and not
I
as
would say
commodities.
that the mechanics of class struggle itself necessitate class solidarity and starts to dissolve those attitudes, along with the general raising of class consciousness.
I mean, I do think it definitely dissolved because the kind of frustrations are based on a very liberal individualist basis. You, as an individual, are frustrated with this one individual involved in the service. You're not, like, thinking of the class antagonisms as a whole. It's a very, like, interpersonal issue.
And it does go back to that underlying reification of a worker being packaged in with a commodity they are buying. So you do not view the person as a person. You do not even view them as a worker or anything like that. They are simply a part of the commodity you purchased at any given time.
In that way, I suppose the frustration could be viewed in the same way as purchasing a coat and then realizing there's a hole in it. You perceive this issue with the commodity itself.
Yeah, I agree with like all the points made. I think I specifically brought this up because that is one thing I know with some of my friends and even my girlfriend of just talking about solidarity and stuff. And even even just more generally socialism is sometimes this conception of the world now, especially in the United States, is essentially fundamentally changed. That now, again, like communism was a thing that was meant for the industrial laborer, and now factories are essentially being, wiped out, and that's not really a thing anymore. And it could be hard sometimes to try to like reach out and try to understand, well, it's like, well, the thing is, a lot of things haven't fundamentally changed about capitalism just because there are new kinds of jobs. And that is something where I remember it was even brought up with my girlfriend where she talked about, customers need to like essentially get their heads out their asses and, realize we're people too, and that sort of thing. And I don't necessarily think that even like her conception sometimes is that different from really any other worker sometimes who's like really in the thick of it and is incredibly frustrated with basically working at Burger King or working, at Walmart or something like that, Because I feel like if we're able to essentially penetrate a lot of that ideology, then like there can actually be some engagement and some real discussion with working class people who are in those sectors of capitalism, and in a sentence, breaking that ideological barrier, I guess.
So next week we will be looking at political economy. We've got some short videos from Richard Sullivan, Richard Wolff. Then we've got some of Marx's shorter economic essays, including Wage, Labour and Capital, Estranged Labour, and Value, Price and Profit.